If you've been keeping your stitch length the same for both your piecing and your quilting, you may find that you're not getting the results that you want. And there is a very easy and very quick fix to this. So let me show you. Who am I? I am Kim. This is Quilt with Kim. You, my lovely, are very, very welcome. Let's have a look at piecing first. Now on this little sample piece here, I've got two stitch lengths. So I've got 2mm over on the left and I've got 3.5mm over on the right. Now, the rule for piecing and quilting is generally that we have a small stitch length for piecing. So we'd have our 2mm stitch length for piecing. That is when we're stitching the two pieces of our fabric together to make our patchwork. That's the bit that's called piecing. And then we'd have the 3.5mm stitch length, so it's longer for our quilting because we've got to go through more layers. I have got a whole video explaining why you need to increase and decrease your stitch length, which I will link up down below. But let's have a look at piecing to see the difference between our small stitch length and our longer stitch length. So first of all, I have just done a one stitch line. So I have done 2mm up to this line, and then I changed the machine into 3.5 mils. So it is one continuous stitch line. So if I open it up, now here is our 2mm. If you can see here that that seam is nicely and tightly stitched together, you can't see the stitches and it is tight and will hold tight for you. When you get to the 3.5mm stitch length, if I open, look, immediately you can see those stitches. We don't want that on our patchwork because we are going to be pressing these seams as open as we can. So we don't really want that look in our patchwork. So that's why our piecing stitch length should be around 2mm or 2.2mm, somewhere around there. Also look what happens, because I do see a lot of comments about, well, my stitching has come apart at the end of my seam lines. Generally in piecing, we don't lock stitch at the end. That's where we do a little reverse stitch and come forward again to lock that stitch into place. As I said, generally we don't do that in piecing, and that's because we normally have a shorter stitch length. And if we're using a 2mm stitch length, we don't tend to have that opening up at the end here. Now, okay, I've started a little bit down that fabric here, but you can see that that is holding pretty tight against me pulling it, which obviously you're not going to do. But over on this side where the 3.5, look what happens. It doesn't take much and I'm not pulling hard, and that seam is opening up, so we don't want that. So for your piecing, you need your small tight 2mm stitch length. Obviously you'd catch in the ends, so that isn't going to happen, and you'd keep your 3.5 for your quilting. But let me show you the difference on the quilting. Okay, quick interruption just before we carry on. If you are a beginner and you get confused by all these terms, I promise you are not the only one. We all did, including me. And that's why I put together a beginner quilter's quick start toolkit that you can download for free right now. Just in the description below, you'll find the link. In it, it explains all those funny terms. It tells you what equipment to buy without wasting any money at all. And it tells you the types of projects that you need to start with when you're a beginner, so that you do not get overwhelmed by what's in front of you. Just get your free guide now. Click the link down in the description below and it will be yours in your email in a few seconds. Right, let's get on with the video. Okay, so here we are with our little quilting sample, and the same thing again. I've done a stitch line or a quilting line with 3.5mm, and then I've done another little stitch line with that 2mm that we would have used on our piecing, and you can see the difference straight away with those two. If I hold them up a little bit closer to camera, you can see here with our 3.5, and that's generally what we should be using for our quilting. Possibly 3, maybe up to 4. It really depends on how thick your quilt is or how thick your wadding is. If you've got a thick wadding, you would definitely want to increase this stitch length. If you've got a very thin wadding, and this particular one is a bamboo and wadding mix or a wadding blend, but if you've got a thin wadding, you can afford to come down a little bit. But I tend to stick to 3.5mm stitch length for quilting because you can see how this stitch line shows nicely on the top of my quilt. And quilting has 2 or 3 jobs to do, one of which is to be decorative. Okay, the other job is to hold all the layers together. And if you want to know, the third job is to create little pockets of air so it makes our quilts all snuggly buggly. But definitely one of its reasons is to provide that decoration on top of our quilt. So we want a stitch line that is going to show and sit nicely on the surface of our quilt and show as a quilting line itself. Compare that to the 2mm stitch length and you can see that the machine's really been struggling as it's going through the 3 layers here. It looks like the tension is out a bit because it's struggling, and I can see the bobbin thread pulling up and it's just all not very happy. And actually this makes it a smaller stitch because it's going through more layers. If I compare it to the 2mm on 2 pieces of fabric and compare that to the 2mm on our quilting, so we've got 3 layers here, the 2mm on the piecing, it's not bigger, it is still 2mm, but when you measure that, those stitches would be 2mm. If I measured these, they would be shorter because we've got more thickness for our thread to go through. So what happens is our thread bunches up and it puckers up and it pulls against each other as the machine is trying to make that stitch length through all the layers. And it just doesn't look as pretty or as professional or a nicer finish as perhaps the 3.5mm quilting line here. Of course, it is entirely your choice. It's a creative decision, but generally, because we have got thick layers, we've got more layers to go through, we need to increase our stitch length so our machine doesn't struggle and can give us a nice even stitch line that's not pulling on itself and not struggling, not puckering our fabric or doing anything else like that, because that can happen too. It gives us a nice even quilting stitch line to be decorative on top of your quilt. So I do hope that has helped you understand why you need a different stitch length for your piecing and your quilting. But if you need to understand some more about stitch length and why it matters to change it, because it does no matter what you're sewing, you will want to watch this video coming up here now. And yes, you can have a good laugh at my expense. If this has helped, please don't forget to like, subscribe and hit that notification bell. I will love you and leave you for now, and I will look forward to seeing you next time. Bye for now.